Thank you again for being here. It is my great pleasure to turn this program over to Museum Director Brian Kennedy.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon to you all, and thanks for coming out in such numbers on this lovely day. For more than 50 years, Werner Pfeiffer has been making constructions and in lots of different ways, and with paper in particular, but using it as a canvas, using it as a support material. He's been a sculptor, a printmaker, a painter. He's been collected nationally and internationally. His work is, I don't know, it has an aspect of wizardry about it. I'm sure if you have already enjoyed it, you will see that. And during our conversation, I'm going to invite Werner to maybe show us a couple of books over there on the table there, so that you can see what he does. But we produced a little brochure that you can pick up for this exhibition, Drawn, Cut and Layered. And it's in the manner of a flexagon. And I just want to ask Werner, could he actually quickly show us how to unfold it?
All right, I'll do that. A flexagon is really a kind of an ancient paper folding system, and what it does is kind of an architectural structure. It has a kind of the magic of returning to itself. And the way it is achieved, you take two sheets of paper and mount them together, but you mount them in a very special way. You mount them on the corners, so the middle is loose. And then you score on each side a kind of a crease into the paper, so the paper can move relatively easy into this direction. And then you do the same thing on the other side. There's another crease line, and do the same thing. Fold the crease and do it from the opposite side, and then you have basically the format set. And this is how we started originally. And then you open it up this way, and then you fold it this way, and it opens in this fashion. And then you have this cross here, and you open it this way, and it keeps going, and then you'll go to the last step, which is returning it to where you started. And when once you get hooked, you keep doing this forever now.
Okay, so in the opposite of what's usually said, please try this at home. Werner didn't know we were going to do this, actually, so when he came into the exhibition, he saw that we had actually taken this model, our staff had. But you can see how quickly he did that, and it's for those of you who are brilliant at the Rubik's Cube, those of you who are not, like me, will feel somewhat challenged. So let's begin. Werner, you were born in Germany in 1937. What was it like growing up in Germany during the war?
It was very unusual, let's put it this way. I was born, as Ryan said, right at the beginning of the Second World War. I was 2 years old when the war started. And it was a kind of a turbulent, unreal scenario. I remember I was, as a child, from age 3 to about 4 or 5, I never undressed, because we had to be ready at a moment's notice to run into the cellar. Every house had a cellar, so you could protect yourself from air raids and so on. So it was a normal thing for me to just go to bed with my shoes on, my clothes on, coat on, and then when the alarms went off, boom, you had to run down the stairs and go in the cellar. And this was a way of life. So there were incidents in that period that I sort of reconstructed later on what it really meant and what it did to me. And there's some images in the show that go back to that period of time. I'll explain a little later, but that had a profound impact. And in many ways, I lived in this in a city like the city of Stuttgart. It's about the same size as Toledo, about 600,000 people. Highly industrial town, so it was a target for attacks, air raid attacks, so. My first day in school, I remember I was 6 years old. I went to school, went to classroom. Before the teacher could say anything, the air raid went off, and we all ran to the cellar. When we came up, there was no school; it was bombed. So it was the only day in school in the city, and then I moved. The city was, declared unfit for kids. They evacuated all the kids, like they did in London. They did in big cities where the war went through, where the Nazis attacked. And it was just a childhood, and living in war is misery. It's horrible. And so I was moved to the countryside in the Black Forest, and it was the most idyllic a bucolic life, and I learned things that I would never want to miss. And it was because of the war events I was thrown into this almost medieval way of life. They had barely electricity, there was no phone, there was no heating. The heat was basically the cows in the basement that heated the house, and on top was the bedroom and the living room, so that's how you lived. And only later did I put this together, that there was this peculiar smell in the house. Whenever you went home, it was the cows. Anyway, this was sort of my youth, and then that part of the world deteriorated too, because it was close to the French border, and when the war ended, basically the front went through our village. We had tanks and machine guns going off everywhere. And so I saw the spectrum of war that we read about this every day, and conflicts in the world, every place, and the innocent kids, they always get stuck, they always get hurt by it, And so I went through that, and it took a couple of years to recover, and then I went back to a normal life, if there's such a thing as normal life.
But you didn't see your father for quite a long time.
No, I was 2 when my father was drafted. That was in 1939, and he came back in 1947. So it was just, as I said, I grew up with women. There were no men. The only men we had when we were living on the farm were prisoners of war. We had Russians and French prisoners of war that helped on the farm. And the only other adults I knew were women. And so my whole youth, my whole early years were all, kind of influenced by strong women, who really took over and managed life in the village and on the farm.
One of the works in the exhibition is quite extraordinary. You've taken sort of medieval machines of war and then tracked them along a huge, long work which tells the story of all the wars of the 20th century.
Right, that's a piece called Errantry, and that's a kind of a book in the form of a scroll. A scroll is, they roll up, and it's an early form of a book. And that piece came about in a long period of gestation, and I first got the idea for doing something like this when I discovered a print cycle called the Triumphant Procession by Maximilian. Emperor Maximilian had charged Dürer and Burgmeier, some of the prominent artists of his time, to do images that depicted life at the time. And it was like always, the war image was very prominent, soldiers and shields and helmets and horses and armor and all this stuff. And so the procession was carriages and movement that was very pronounced and very stark and very, very sharp and aggressive. And so I got this image in my head and then said, I have to do something that depicts something of what I went through, what I lived through. And that's how I sort of put this down as a kind of a thought process. Came back to it a couple of years later. I did some drawings in the process that really had the same feeling, kind of a lot of carriages that were very aggressive and sharp and cutting and slinging stuff around. And then I discovered a poem by Tolkien. And the poem is called Errantry, and it's about essentially a character or a form that is sort of marauding the world and doing damage. And everyone said, are you talking about war? I said, no, I'm not talking about war. But I shifted the poem, kept his rhythm and his diction, and there's a certain pulse that he has in doing his poetry. And I kept this and made it distinctly war, and then I found data and collected data about every conflict, every war in the 20th century. And I lined it up on a 28-foot long scroll that you walk along and you read where every conflict took place and how long it lasted, how many victims there were. And by the time you have passed 27 feet, you can count 180 million people that have vanished in 1 century. There were 4 big blocks, basically. The First World War, the Second World War with the Holocaust and the atrocities that happened in Europe. Then you had the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The people just disappeared. We don't know. They just vanished, gone. And these were the 4 big blocks that really made that piece up. And that's in the exhibit. You can see that.
So one of the aspects for you growing up was that books were rare. On the one hand, books were loathed by those who therefore censored them. And on the other hand, they were loathed by those who had to consume propaganda. So can you talk about books in your
Yeah, I think I grew up essentially without books, because they were not available. Paper was scarce, and whatever they had was, either propaganda or the other form of paper. I think I wrote in a little essay was leaflets falling from the sky, telling the population you have to rise up against this Nazi regime. And so these are the two forms of paper I knew: propaganda and anti-propaganda. And then in between, there was very little material available for school books or for recreational use. Paper was rationed like everything else was. And so it was a part of that period also was the gross impact of censorship by the regime, the Nazi regime. They began their horror regime by burning books. That's the big event, and it led eventually to the destruction and burning of people, as we all know, in the Holocaust. And it's so I was extremely sensitive to this whole issue of censoring, of interfering with a kind of process where one mind talks to another one. I mean, a third party comes in and says, no, you can't do that. That is offensive, and it's still with us, And so I began doing a series of works based and inspired by a censorship, not specifically interpreting censorship, but it was stimulated and sort of driven by me having read about an incident. And what I did is naturally I went to the most obvious symbol, which is the book. The book was always the target by the censor, was always the most dangerous thing that we can imagine is really the book. The most potent weapon is a book, So that's why the censors go about it and censor it. And so I used the book, and the first thing I did is I sort of neutralized it because I wanted to really express the idea of censorship in a total way, so not even leave a word, not even leave a kind of a sign what the book was about. And so I began from the very start to use white books. Everything is glued together, and when you see the book objects in the show, inside each of the book is a real book. There are 300, 400, 500 sheets of paper that I glue together, and then I hack it and nail it and screw it together and mutilate it. But the idea is essentially you have to be the devil's advocate to make a point. And I love books myself, and one of the kind of schizophrenic things I have to do is when I work with books, I can't open it. When I open it, I start reading, I can't use it, so it's just not possible. So I just almost at arm's length take a look at how it looks and glue around it, and then it's done, and that's how it works,
So you love paper. I mean, what's so fascinating about paper?
Well, it's a very intriguing material, particularly when you know a little bit how it's made. I think paper has a long history, about 3,000 years. It came from China in its original form. If you ever have made paper, if some of you might have done that and know about how it's made, paper is essentially a pulp. It's a slush. It's 95 or 98% water. So that's why paper mills, they're usually on a river and they pollute the river a little bit here and there. What happens? And but essentially, this transition from this liquidy form into a sheet is very fascinating, and it's done by siphoning out what is fibrous material, and that forms a sheet. And you can do it by hand, having a little siphon, and you scoop it out and you shake it a bit, and it becomes flat, a sheet of paper. And then it dries, and you have suddenly this surface you can work with. And then I got, because of the lack of paper, when I finally had the chance to use it, I was very intimidated by it. It scared me, like the big sheet of blank paper. It was very expensive, and I was very intimidated. So it gave me great respect to have for paper. And then I used it naturally, like everyone does. You make notes and drawings, and a little incidents that happened along the way. When the paper first came back into my life, it was in school. We had a notebook, but we had one notebook for a year, for 2 or 3 classes. And what we did is we used the notebook in very small print, writing horizontally in one color. When that was done, you turned the notebook 90 degrees and wrote in another color across that. So we made this wonderful kind of artist book-like kind of calligraphy pieces. I'm sort of mad I don't have anymore, but I was very intrigued by that. And that sort of was my sort of first vis-a-vis paper. Before that, I was doing mostly my drawing and writing on a slate tablet. And there was the way you started in school. You wrote on an actual piece of slate that was framed. There was a little sponge on the side, and you had a stylus, and you scratched on it. And in school, you did your homework, and the teacher came and said, okay, fine, and then wiped it off, and then you do that again, and so on and so forth. So when I was thinking about this whole paper idea, so I said, this was really the beginning of the paperless process. We had a tablet. It was a very primitive tablet, but it was paperless nonetheless. And so this is how my history of paper sort of evolved. And
You're an extraordinarily disciplined person, and I'm wondering, is the root of that in the fact that when you left school you took on an apprenticeship?
Oh yeah, I mean, I went through high school, and before I ended college or art school, I took a 2 or 3 year apprenticeship in the graphics industries, which was kind of a highly popular way of sort of training a workforce. It's still happening in Europe. In many countries they still have that. And the way it's set up is you go 3 or 4 days to school and to work, and then 1 or 2 days to school. And the Germans have this disciplinarian, process, and you just do it. And it sort of, at the time it hurts and you rebel, but in the long run, when you go through it and you adapt, there's a benefit to it, because you learn something that has a lifelong kind of support for you, because you become disciplined, and you learn that if you do something, you might as well do it right. Why mess around and do it halfway? So this was instilled in that process of apprenticing into a trade, and then right after I finished, I went to art school and continued the creative side of my side.
And then in your 20s, you decided to come to America in 1961.
Right.
Why America? Did you intend to stay, or were you just leaving?
Well, it was interesting. There were 2 reasons. I was a very adventurous kid, and B, I had to deal with the history of my country where I grew up. There was a lot of baggage, that you went through and you lived with, and so you questioned everybody. You looked around and said, was this a gilded guy? Was this some, So there was constantly this questioning, bouncing ideas off. And then I decided I like to get away. I like to have a distance to it. And being an adventurer, I thought, I'll go to America. And at the same time, America was booming. There were 2 things. The art scene had moved from Europe to New York. There was stuff happening everywhere. At the same time, there was this very optimistic political climate. Kennedy had been elected, and there was this hope, this great kind of optimism in this country. So it was a place to be, And like all people that come from Europe, we come for a year or for half a year. So after a year, I said, I like it here. I'm going to stay a little longer. And then, it's 2 years, and then 3 years. And then after 3 years, I said, where am I going to? I'm not going back there. So I stayed, and here, it's 50 years later, I'm still here.
So tell us how you came to work at the Pratt Institute in New York.
Now, there was a fun story. When the trip, or the trip from Europe to the States was kind of supported by a friend I met at art school. He was an American who was there on a Fulbright. And so we talked a lot about my interest in traveling in the States, and he said, I'll sponsor you. So he helped me get along. And he was kind of a romantic who was into printing and printmaking and type and typography. And he had gone to Cooper Union, a good background, was a good artist, and then he had moved to Vermont. So he took me to Vermont, to a little village up by the Canadian borders, a little town called Lunenburg. And it was like, I've never seen a place like this, so in this town there was a little print shop, and they had actually a chicken coop that was converted into a production facility. And I worked there for the summer, and I couldn't believe what was going on. Their clients were the Metropolitan Museum, now the Frick Collection, Dartmouth College. I said, what are these people doing here, And this was one of the premier typographers in the United States. His name was Steinhauer, Rocky Steinhauer. And so it was a very fortuitous, situation for me to be there, because I met a lot of people. And I made my first trip to Dartmouth. at the time, and I said, Jesus, I went to school. We went to school with a hammer to clean bricks because we had to rebuild the school at Dartmouth. They had, sculling on the river, and they had this. I said, this is not true, And so it was a very interesting juxtaposition. And at Steinhauer's in Lunenburg, I met a person from Pratt who they were doing a magazine for Pratt, and again, like in the boondocks, so. And I had this special background, having trained in the graphic art industry and being an artist. So he said, listen, we need somebody like you. We want to set up a book arts program, and we need a facility for typography. And so I was hired, and spent the first year there. And at the time when I was still thinking, I had to go back. And I was on a special visa because it was the beginning of the Vietnam conflict. And I didn't see myself going to Vietnam, coming to America. So I had to renew my visa every year and then once I had this sort of assignment at Pratt, they said, well, we fix it. So they fixed it, and I got my green card, so that made it relatively easy. And it was, I was supposed to be there a year, and I stayed there 42 years.
So you retired from there in, was it 2005?
In 2003. 2003, yeah, 2003.
So you had decades of seeing students come through.
Oh yeah,
living the life of a professor.
Right.
Tell us about that experience of being a teacher and a practicing artist.
It's quite interesting. It was a new experience when I started that, and I was younger than most of the students because there was the time when the Korean veterans came to use their scholarships to study, and then half the male students were all in their 30s, and like 20s, and I was like 23, and I said, what these guys are doing. So it was an interesting time, but I always liked the idea of teaching. It was a wonderful exchange when you meet a group of kids and you would talk about something, you can make an imprint within a 6 months or 3 months period, and you see something stays there and something takes root. That was very powerful. And being involved in the teaching process, naturally you get involved, you get sucked into the academic side, and which I did for about 6 or 7 years, and I didn't like that. So it was essentially, I gave up my tenure and said, okay, I'm just going to be part-time. And that part was wonderful. I did this for almost 30 years. I did part-time teaching and had fascinating students from all walks of life. Probably my most famous student was Robert Redford. He was studying graphic design before he went into acting. And I remember standing with him when he talked about he had just gotten married and talked about his interest in acting, and so. We chatted, and I said, this guy's probably full of hot air. But as funny as it is, our path crossed later in life. He was doing a movie called Out of Africa. And the writer of the Isaac Dennison, the biographer, she was a friend. She lived next door, and so he came up, and that's how it works sometimes in life.
And you also had a very distinguished role as longtime director of Adlib Press.
Right. The Adlib Press was an attempt by a former colleague of mine who started it actually to produce published works by students. And that was in the late 50s, early 60s. The idea of doing artist books was not yet that popular. And so we began to put together a kind of a publishing venture where we used student works. They were done in limited editions, printed from original plates, like etchings and woodcuts, and they were highly regarded and got into a lot of collections. And after a couple of years, this friend of mine, this colleague, he retired, and I took over the press, and we did probably altogether 20, 25 titles. Done in very small editions. They were distributed through libraries and through art collections in museums. And it was a kind of a vehicle for myself because I started doing books and publishing some of these things. And that's how I really got to the Toledo Museum, which was an interesting coincidence. One of the collectors, big collectors of artist books is Walter Barrios, which is he's married to a Toledo native. And he was on the board of the Modern, and he was in Germany at the museum in Munich and helped establishing artist book collections. And he gave his collection to the Toledo Museum. He said, New York has enough, the modern has enough, so Toledo needs it. So and that's how a book of mine got here, and that's how I started making connections. And that's.
So some of you may know that aside from MoMA, Toledo Museum of Art has the greatest collection of 20th century artist books in any museum in America. Yes. And that effort is to continue over time, but I want to take a moment just to congratulate Tom Luffler, who has curated this show. Tom, do you want to stand up? I think everybody might want to give you a round of applause. Tom, working with the whole team here, has made a beautiful exhibition. One of the things about this exhibition we wanted to do was to present Werner in the digital age. So we've created a digital e-publication that you can get on Apple. You can get it free, you can download it. You can also go on YouTube and you can get full interview with Werner, but also little pieces of interviews with Werner, all free as well. But this is rather curious, Werner, isn't it? Because you're not exactly a early adapter.
No, I'm not a digital person in many ways. But what is true at the same time, the digital time and the digital format is really a technique, as was printing, as was different things, and so it's really just the translation of an idea. What counts still is the ultimate, is the idea. If you have the idea, your vehicle, how to produce it and how to bring it out, is really just a support. But if you write a story and it's printed in paper or it's put on a tape, if the story is good, the technique doesn't really interfere. If the story is lousy, the technique doesn't improve it. So in that sense, I'm very kind of open to the idea of the digital time, and I'm a realist in that sense that change does take place. I went through several changes in terms of material and techniques that have, for instance, the part of the profession I trained for is in my apprenticeship is completely gone. There are no more typographers. Remember, there used to be the newspapers were hamstrung by typographers and they could shut the paper down. They're gone. Nobody uses the technique anymore. So phase in and phase out happens all the time. And I think the digital age is not permanent, I believe. There will something come after that. And I had I have a friend who she's a digital archivist, and I had a long discussion. I said, what is coming next? What is the next venue? And she said, well, there are already experiments done where instead of storing information in digital form, you store it in form of DNA, artificial DNA, which is a complete different way of thinking. There's no electricity involved, there's no storage. And what we have discovered, we find DNA from kind of an animal 10,000 years ago, and we can reconstruct it. And that's what they're building on. That we have essentially a way of putting data in an artificial DNA structure, and in 10,000 years, we open it up, and there it is. We can reconstruct it.
I think that's why your own work is going to have a very long life, because. I'm just back from a conference where they're really trying to drill into 186 museum directors that content is king. That we need to understand that everything that the digital age has brought to us is a tool, really, to disseminate content. One of the ways we gathered content for this little Q&A is that we set up, you like this, a hashtag Werner. And we invited people to contribute questions that I might ask you. So
good.
I was fascinated. That's really, a lot of them are about technique. So here's somebody saying, what are the essential key tools someone should have in their toolbox if they're just getting into paper folding and paper crafting?
I think the first thing you need is a good knife, a good scissors, and you need a folding bone. A folding bone is an instrument that's actually a piece of bone. The original one was a piece of cow bone. And what it does, it's shaped as a flat kind of tool that's pointed on one end, round on the other end, and has an edge, sharp edge. And with applying pressure on that point or on that edge, you can create like tons of pressure on a point. Like for instance, when you shave with a razor blade, there's something like 6 tons of pressure on the edge of the blade. And you notice when you're not paying attention, you cut yourself. And the same is with this folding bone. It makes it possible for you by hand to crease a sheet of paper in absolute perfect way. And that's a tool I think you need. And but I think to retract a little bit, I think the primary idea, whatever you do, you need an idea first. No, that's the main tool in your kit is your idea. And then you shape the idea and you do it in a way where the material is supporting it and supplementing the kind of dimensions that you want to get.
Here's another question. What role does spontaneity play in your process?
You have to sometimes let go, you know. Like when you look at my work, a lot of it looks like it's very tight and it's very kind of controlled, but it's controlled chaos, as I say many times. When you look at some of the collages, there are hundreds and thousands of pieces of paper that are floating and rotating, and they're set against the background that's sort of mushy and soft and has a lot of different directions. So I'm trying to control this in a way, but there's still a spontaneity to let it flow, because and that's a skill when it's almost an editing process where you say, okay, it's enough, you know, let go and stop and do this and I find, for instance, in the process of doing collages on paper, to me it's a dance, you know, because you put a piece down and it starts controlling the space, and if you put another piece next to it, there's suddenly a kind of a counterweight, and then you start moving them around, and it's really a dance. And then at some point you have to make a decision. Okay, where's the point where they meet? Where's the point where the tension starts? Where the image becomes what you want it to be, the energy and so I do this like daily almost in terms of an exercise, and then sometimes I add embossments, again using a tool like the folding bone. And another tool that's sort of a handmade tool I make myself is a little embossment knob that I use with washers, and I work in a light box, and the light box gives me the direction where I have to push from the other side, and it's the same principle. I use an old doorknob that gives me a handle, so I can translate the elbow grease into this one little nail and this one little round nail, and then press it. And if you do it right, the paper is not too dry, you make wonderful embossments, which would be impossible and terribly prohibitive expensive to do it mechanically. And I've sort of developed these techniques over years and years, and I've done prints and collages, always boom, 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 do my knobs.
And what do you do to get going in the morning when you go into your studio?
It's interesting. I usually, to the chagrin of my wife, she usually doesn't like when I leave a mess on my desk, but if I leave a mess, I'm ready to go. Otherwise, I have to start kind of doing certain motions in order to get back into work, you know. Like all of us, we have different cycles, we have different ways. I'm a night person, essentially. My creative time is in, let's say, from 5 to 10 o'clock at night. In the mornings, I'm a zombie. I just do mechanical stuff and sort of mope around. But this is the process of getting going. So I sometimes open a drawer just to look at what I did, and then, you know, sort of reinforce an idea, reinforce a gesture, and so it leads back into work. But I'm in there at 9, and inevitably I have to be there every day. You know, there's no other way.
How did you feel when you walked into the exhibition and saw it first? What impact did it have? Were there any discoveries there? I had a lovely earwig on a conversation last night where a young girl was saying to her father, "Did one person make all of this?"
Yeah. Well, what I was experiencing was quite fascinating. First of all, I must congratulate Tom and Claude and Brian for putting this thing up, and they did an incredible job. They took positions and angles and ways putting things together, which I didn't think of, you know. Like, for instance, there's one point where the 4 panels meet in the middle. There's this column of books hanging. It's powerful, you know, and it needs that community of people that put up shows, you know, that understand what you do, and that's, I thought it was perfectly merged. It was wonderfully done. And so when you walk into a show, you kind of anticipate, well, there could be something wrong, but I had no criticism, nothing. Everything was perfect, and better than I would have put it up myself. And because when you work with your own material, you have a preset sense of you know, concept, the way it should be done. And when somebody who's sensitive, who puts it up, you know, outside of your own framework, that's much better because suddenly you discover something you wouldn't have thought of, and so I'm extremely pleased.
Great. One of the things we wanted to do with the e-publication is to demonstrate to you how these books work, because a little frustrating. You know, they're made in very small editions so that the people who own them would use them, and of course we don't let you do that in the exhibition. So I'm wondering, Werner, whether you might show us how a book or two might work over
Sure. Part of my thinking when I do particular books, even other objects, I've done sculptures that are possible, that can move and adjust. I've done paintings that you can readjust, and by using either Velcro or by using magnets or using zippers, so you can reconfigure a piece. And when I started doing books, that was sort of an undercurrent of all my sort of interest, that I want people to learn to read not just passively with their eyes, but with their hands, and be visually charged and be involved in the process of seeing the book and forming the book. So I have 2 or 3 books that are sort of showing and demonstrating this. The first one is a piece that I did about 6 or 7 years ago. It was inspired by a Dutch artist, printer, journalist by the name of Werkman, Hendrik Werkman. He was a man who got sort of trapped in the currents of the Second World War, worked underground because of his skills as a printer. He did underground work and printed anti-Nazi propaganda. They caught him and they killed him in the last week of the war. The Gestapo confiscated all his work, and it was in their headquarters. A bomb hit the headquarters and his work was gone. So all that's around is essentially what was in the hands of his fellow conspirators, the underground people. And the biggest collection probably at this point is in the little museum called Klingspor in Germany. And from the earliest days when I was a student in the art school, we floated this. There was a couple of people who had sort of seen some of the work, and we floated this concept of this man's work. And it's basically a combination of word and type combination, typograms, where he played sort of in a very playful way, but with a serious undertone. And whatever I saw, I was very intrigued, and so I did a book in the same style, interpreting what I would think could be a possibility that might be related to Werkman. And the title of the book came about. He was attacked by some local critics that he was doing nonsense. It was nothing really serious. And it's just abracadabra. And he said, abracadabra, this is the greatest word that I've used. So I called my book Abracadabra. And the book is about, it begins here with the fin. And the abracadabra essentially was a medieval kind of myth. If you put the word abracadabra in a shape like a triangle, and you wear it on your neck or you wear it on your arm, in this form, it fends off bad spirits. So this is a kind of a mythology. It didn't do any good for Werkman. It didn't help him. So the beginning is essentially a series of steps explaining how I came about Werkman and what Werkman did. And what you see, I'm using the type in a very free form. It floats around, and the punctuation marks and the black bar are kind of elements that point towards the final form. So I'm going to run very quickly through this so we don't. So each page is slightly different. What you see here, if you can in the subtle light, instead of numbers on the bottom, I use little embossments. So there are little bumps in there that really come back to this kind of tool that I'm using. And then you get into, after you introduce the story, you get to essentially the word abracadabra, and it looks essentially like this. This is A, and this is B, and this is R, abra, and then comes cadabra, and they're all designed to interpret one letter. So I spell out the word abracadabra through the entire book. And I'm sort of just doing it a little quicker here. Then I took this word abracadabra and wrapped it around a flexagon, the piece that I showed you earlier. And this is how the flexagon came into the fabric of the museum, I think.
Yes.
And this is the same system. The only thing here, I used much heavier material. So when you hold this thing, it almost tells you by its own weight that it bounces into the direction that you want it to be. So again, it's the same principle. Here's A, B, abra, R, and then you have A. This is the first 4, and the word I realized has only 11 letters, so I had to fabricate one. So I need, because the flexagon has 4 sides, you need the 4 sides. So here's the middle piece. This is abra, cadabra, and you see there's a card in there which I use. Here's Ka, and then it goes over here, D, and over here. Here's the last one. There's the last A. And then we go back. And the card that I have in there is simply just if you want to use these flexagons as sculptures, you set them up like this so they stand up by themselves. And the third one, same principle. Here's the B, R. And what you see in some of the letter forms, I echo some of the contemporaries of Bergman. There's Mondrian and the Steele people that were doing this kind of stuff. And so anyway, here I ran into trouble. There was abracadabra. That's out. Then I had to go back to the cover and really play a game with that. And so this became the cover, and it's actually quite fun. And then again here you can set this up in a different structure. You can put this in here, in the middle, so it looks different. And so you have really like building structures, architectural structures that make the book. And this is what I'm trying to project, that a person should touch this. It's not something that sits in a box and you just don't want to go near it. The idea is that you really work with it. And so there are several other books that I did. I can show you that quickly. And
so Werner, can I interrupt just to ask you?
Yeah.
I think one of the most fascinating things about your work is that you engage with letters, for example, numbers, but you are actually making works that are not textual objects. I mean, you deconstruct language.
Right. Yeah.
So what's your commentary then on the nature of text and image and the big scholarship around whether they're different, whether they're the same, whether image incorporates text?
Well, I think I find they are fluid. There's a fluidity between word and image, you know. I mean, when you really think of language, our alphabet in the language we speak, the alphabets, they come actually from images. The letter A used to be called Aleph, used to be the shape of an ox. When you go back to the original form where our letters come from, they were visual forms. Then we added this phonetic content to it, and it became part of the language. And what we're doing now, we're probably getting out of that and moving back into the picture form. Like when you think in terms of the idea of a corporate identity, the trademark, what is that? This is really stripping the phonetic part out of numbers and letters and making a picture that we read, you know. And so they're all sort of interchangeable and interrelated in some ways.
Yeah. So this is just to make the point. I mean, obviously we plan our exhibition program. So as you go outside and play with Barjan Bogosian's wall screens and make your own pictogram, you're dealing with the difference between pictographic and logographic language. And of course, we have a whole platform here of, on one hand, working with artists, but also teaching visual literacy and visual language. And so you can see why Werner is just absolutely perfect for this sort of education. Now, you're probably going to try and put that away, are you?
Yeah, I'm just going to, it goes very quickly.
I know you can do it twice as fast as everybody else. So has anybody got a question?
Yeah, anybody questions
okay,
about this?
We'll just wait for the microphone. Please, this lady here. Well, we want to record you, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. Live microphone.
Thank you so much for your beautiful work.
Thank you.
Lovely. In Ireland, you know, they're known for their vellum.
Yeah.
And the monks stretched vellum. And I have two questions. Have you ever played with vellum? And secondly, the monks would take the scraps and make poems, which we still have, thank goodness.
Wow.
What do you do with your scraps?
That's a good question, because I have in my studio more boxes full with scraps than anyone can imagine. And I do, as you've seen some of the images that come from, instance, these are the end stages of the scraps. These pieces are about this big. And I start with larger collages, and whatever gets cut off gets into a mid-sized box, and it gets a smaller box, and it gets the mini-sized box. And that's my raw material. So I work with that consistently, you know, and I have a hard time throwing things away because of my upbringing with this lack of paper, so I have great respect for it. And so I'm a recycler, constant recycler, and make images. It's just the scale that gets diminished when you start chopping and chopping and chopping. In the end, there's nothing left. So, but I do work with that.
And what about vellum?
Vellum, I have not really worked with because vellum is a little bit tricky to fold. It breaks. You see, vellum is a form of paper. When you really analyze it, it has a fiber. And when you look at paper, the papers that are very transparent and very hard, they have the fiber chopped down to the minimum size, so it has a good hard sound. The papers that are spongy, like tissue papers, household tissues, they have very long fibers. They're very absorbent, and you can see it when you tear it apart. And so these are the two extremes. So working with vellum and folding it and as a structure thing, it's not very conducive. So as a surface, I have used it in terms of using its transparency and working with the background behind it and so on. Yes, but not as a structural thing. I've not done that.
Werner, on the back wall of the exhibition, there's a whole series of banana drawings, and we've paid homage to you by providing banana desserts in the Libby Court during the course of your exhibition. But when I walked in, as somebody who grew up in Europe, I grew up with my parents telling me that, oh yes, there were no bananas.
Right.
And so, is that what happened to you?
Oh yeah. I was 8 years old by the time I've seen my first banana. And the only way I saw it, I was fortunate at the time because the house we lived in was backing against some compound that was sort of confiscated by the US Army, and the officers lived there, and there was a kitchen. And when they had their dinners and suppers and their food service, there were always fruits accompanying it. And whatever came back, the kids on the fence got it because we were all hanging on the fence and looking in our eyes and running over, and there were bananas. And I didn't know what a banana was. I'd never seen one. And we didn't know how to eat it, so we bite into it and they'll peel on everything because nobody told us. The discussion never came up that a banana is a fruit that you eat, and it's a very unusual fruit. And somehow this must have sort of locked itself in my subconscious, and then like 30 years later I started doing banana drawings and banana constructions and banana this and banana that, and you can see it in the show. So I did about 7 basic images of banana. There's a portable banana, an electric banana, a two-way banana, a do-it-yourself banana kit, the split banana. And they're essentially, the undercurrent is the juxtaposition and the contrast between a mechanical world and an organic world. I mean, there's nothing more organic than a banana. I mean, you bite it, it's swooshy and eats and wonderful taste and everything. And then I sort of project this against a technology world, machine-like drawings and unusual juxtapositions. And that's sort of the basic kind of concept that runs through this banana series. And I personally, I always love to work in series because you can spill out an idea and elaborate an idea in many different formats. And I find it very rewarding to really do series.
We might look at one more book.
Okay.
While you're getting that out, I did spot somebody else wanted to ask a question up here. Yes.
Yes, I was confused about, you were talking about doorknobs and washers.
Yeah.
Could you pantomime what you were
Yeah, okay.
do?
When you make an embossment in a piece of paper, to deform, to deshape the paper, requires a lot of pressure. Commercially, this is done with 2 plates and a high-powered hydraulic press. And one plate is called a female, the other one's a male. And the form that you emboss is constructed between, and the paper gets shaped in that. To make that is a kind of improvised system. I developed this idea of using the strength you can evolve from your arm, from your muscles, and translate it to one single point. And that single point is a nail, a round-shaped nail that I use on upholstery. Sometimes on old couches and chairs you see these round polished nails. And I stick this nail into a little metal tube, and the back of the metal tube is a door handle. So I translate the power of my pushing in the fullest form into that one point where the nail hits. And to see what I'm doing, I'm putting a washer on a light table and put the piece that needs to be embossed on top. And I can see exactly where the washer hits the round opening, and I press, and voila, there's an embossment. Did that explain it?
No, high
Good.
heel shoes.
Yeah, okay.
Anybody else? One more.
This is another book called Zigzag, and it's essentially a kind of an investigation of material, of folds, of different folds. Excuse me, let me put that there. And it has two parts to it, basically. You open the book here, and there's an introduction, and you see I have the folds and the creases in an unusual way, and then you keep digging into this thing, and it reveals a text. And the principle is here that they are opposite. They are come together, like you have words like in, out, on, off. They are zigzag. It's the same kind of composition, and they are in the same family. And then you can take this thing out and make a structure out of it, make a sculpture, and you can play with this idea in many different ways. Again, the idea of touching it and working with it, hands-on, is the principle here. And so you read and you follow, and you really not go linear, and you keep doing it in the same fashion. So this is the introduction, sort of setting up the stage for folds and for movement. And the actual book then is this here. It opens like this, and you see a shape coming out. And the shape can be removed from its box there. And you see a little card here that you take out, and there's another card in here that comes out on this side. And then you have whatever this makes completely free. And this is a stretch of what is called a double accordion, and which is like a honeycomb. And so there's a text running on one side is about illusion, the other one is about invention. And so they are, again, opposite in terms of their concept. And then what you can do, besides sort of having it sitting flat and on the surface, you can make a circle out of it. And these cards come in, again, as a sort of 8. You slice it in. And the way these things are made, there are two zigzags, two accordions that are basically folded and cut into one another. And let me just finish the circle, and I can go back and show you how this construction is made. So the cards that are used to fasten the piece to the book, the case also come in as a fastening device between the two ends of the zigzag here. And it's just slid in. There's no glue, no fastening device, because of their fact that they're folded together, then they become sort of lodged into one another. So here's the fold, and then you have the, this isn't in yet complete, there we go. See, now we have this thing. And then you can pick this up here, and you have a circle. So a flat sheet of paper becomes a structure, becomes a wheel. It actually turns. And then you can manipulate it even further. If you grab it in the middle and you open the circumference, it becomes this. And you can keep going, and it goes one more time. As much as you have play in the kind of structure. So this has this multifaceted quality. And as I said earlier, I wanted to show you how it's made, basically. There are two accordion. An accordion is a zigzag fold, and I use two of them, and then I slide them in the middle, and I force them together into one another. So you have this honeycomb structure that makes up the piece. And if you want to be very cute, you can even have a slinky. Let me see if I have the bottom here. So it does its trick. So anyway, thank you. Just to show you a possibility of reading books, reading artist books. And it's my feeling that we talked earlier about the book censoring, the change of the book as we know it. There's a lot of artists that are testing the boundaries. Where could the book go? What is the alternative? we are doing a more reading of data and information from the screen, increasingly. So what we need to free the book from that particular function and do something else with it. And I think there's something that we use as a visual tool, as a creative tool, where you work with your hands and your eyes and you experience. And I think for me it's a natural, but when somebody is not into this kind of creative thing, I find that often people are a little inhibited. But once you give them a tool and they start folding, that's the idea about, you know, the Flexagon card, which is wonderful, and which I didn't know, by the way, so it was beautifully kind of echoed in that. And if you start doing it, suddenly you discover something. There's a great feeling when you open something, it comes back and it flows, and it sort of makes a kind of a transition from your emotions into your hands and in your eyes. You know, I think that's what an experience is really, a combination between the heart and the mind and the hand. You know, this is how it works out, you know, in some ways.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I do hope that you will consult the e-publication on iTunes, on YouTube, and on our own website, and just see how truly brilliant Werner Pfeiffer's art is. The exhibition continues until May the 3rd. It is free, and we want to make sure that as many people as possible see it. And word of mouth is absolutely the best way to make sure that that happens, but also on social media. So, you know, hashtag yourself, selfie yourself, and send it off out to the world so that everybody will get a chance to come to see this exhibition over the next 3 months. Can I invite you to give your warmest Toledo applause to Werner Pfeiffer.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, may I return that compliment and ask you to give an applause to Brian and Tom and the staff of the museum, which did a magnificent job. And without that, I wouldn't be here.